Kitty Hart-Moxon was a teenager when she and her mother were sent to the most notorious of all Nazi concentration camps.
Do you want to see my Auschwitz number? For that, we've got to go to the other room. The top number, which is 3993, was my mother's, and that was mine down here. I had it removed because people made stupid remarks, like, is it your boyfriend's telephone number, or is it your laundry mark? And one day I got sick of it. And when my mother died, I asked the coroner to have her number removed, which she did, and they put both of the numbers together.
This week, the world marks the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. It's a human tragedy that's been remembered because of the stories of those who lived it. But as time passes, the survivors are dying. And without their testimonies, how will the echo of the Holocaust be kept alive? In this film, 3 remarkable women reveal just why the memory of one of the darkest moments in human history should never be forgotten.
If this can happen to people, to children, to people, just for being an ethnicity, a religious group, having done nothing apart from being born, then it can happen to anybody.
I do know that my entire life has been a huge gift. I suppose it is to everybody, but I might so easily not have had it.
I believe it's my duty to say what I've witnessed. You need to speak for those that died. You do. You know, at least they're not completely forgotten.
For the last 40 years, as children have eagerly awaited their bedtime story, it's the books and illustrations of Judith Kerr that have filled their imaginations.
Sophie opened the door, and there was a big, furry, stripy tiger.
Her work has delighted generations, from the tiger who came to tea to Mog, the forgetful cat. But it's in another of her books that Judith has captured her memories of a darker past. It's a work which began as a way of telling her family about her childhood, but ended up inadvertently helping a nation haunted by its history learn from the dangers of its past.
I never set out to say I must tell the world about the Holocaust, I must write about Hitler. It wasn't anything like that. It was just what happened to me.
Judith was born into a Jewish family in Berlin in 1923. Her father, Alfred Kerr, was an influential Jewish writer. And as the Nazis began to gain power in the early 1930s, he was quick to grasp their potential for evil.
My father realized rather sooner than anyone else that the Nazis were a terrible threat. And so he wrote about that and also, of course, made fun of them. And so they hated him. They had a list of people that they said, these people we will stand up against a wall and shoot as soon as we come to power. And my dad was number 2 on the list.
Alfred was public and uncompromising in his criticism of the Nazis. They condemned his work, and in 1933, when Goebbels ordered un-German books to be purged by fire, cars were amongst those burnt. Whilst he remained in Germany, he knew his life was in danger.
My father was in bed with flu, and next morning he was gone. I was very frightened. I thought he might have died, but my mother explained to us that he'd fled the country because somebody had rung him up and said, "You must get out, they're trying to take away your passport." So he got up and took the first train out of Germany.
He fled to Switzerland. But as Hitler's popularity grew, the Nazi threat was increasing, and he knew he had to get the rest of his family out. In March 1933, on the eve of German elections, which Hitler was expected to win, Judith, her mother, and her brother Michael caught a train to Zurich. But as the family of a man wanted by the Nazis, it was a journey fraught with potential danger.
I brilliantly almost gave us away at the frontier. Stupid child. But I started to say something. My mother said, when the man comes to look at the passports, not a word. So I didn't say a word until he was just about to go out, when I began to say, "There you are, nothing's happened," cleverly. My mother gave me a terrible look, so I stopped, and we were all right.
As refugees in Switzerland, France, and eventually England, her parents faced the daily terror of knowing their lives were always in danger. But they were determined to protect their children from their own despair.
It didn't occur to me to be frightened. And the fact that I was so happy was, of course, entirely due to my parents, because they were so positive and so protective, and they got us out. So what more? What more can you ask of parents?
It was her desire to pass on her memories of her parents and their life on the run to her own family that inspired Judith to write When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit.
I vaguely sort of talked about it to the children, of course, and one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was because I wanted to tell them what it was like. I mean, I think perhaps I also wanted to tell my husband exactly what it was like, because, well, if you love someone, you want them to know about who you are, and that's who I was.
The book has had an impact Judith could never have envisaged. In the land her father's books were burnt, hers are a set text in schools, introducing German children to the dangers of history.
Was war das Besondere an dem rosa Kaninchen?
Kindheit.
Richtig.
Judith is only too aware that her life could have been so very different.
I do know that my entire life has been a huge gift. I suppose it is to everybody, but I might so easily not have had it.
Whilst Judith started telling her story as a way of explaining to her family who she was, Kitty Hart-Moxon did it as an act of defiance in the face of a world who found her memories too shocking to face. In 1978, Kitty returned for the first time to Auschwitz with her son.
Feeling slightly sick inside, that's all. Just...
Let's go for the head.
Well, I always felt I hadn't been away when I got there. It was a strange feeling that I belonged there, you know. Oh, God.
Pretty advanced, isn't it?
I'll just wait and see. Just wait and see.
From the ages of 16 to 18, this was her home, and her memories of her time here are still vivid.
I always say if you've got extraordinary events, they are embedded, engraved in your brain, aren't they? And you can't actually forget them. Now, this was my block. I was here for months and months in this block. There's one thing that Auschwitz, if nothing else, teaches you to cope with anything that life was going to throw at you. There were about 1,000 people in here, 1,000 women. Some were dead, some were sitting on here. Now, my first night, I slept next to this gypsy, and I didn't know why I was so cold. And I shook this woman, you see, and she was cold, you see. And she died in the night, and she was dead for some hours, and this is why I was so cold, because she was dead. Yeah. And so I said to my mother, I said, now look, she's dead. I know what has got to be done. We've got to have her clothes, and we've got to have her bride ration if she's got one, because it's not good to her. And then it came to me that this was the way to live. You must have it off the dead. To me, I always say Auschwitz was my university, which it was.
Kitty was born in Poland in 1926. It was a happy childhood, but it was interrupted when the Nazis invaded in 1939. And in the eyes of an impressionable 12-year-old, their arrival was dazzling.
I thought they looked absolutely marvelous because they entered with music, a band playing, and that was my first impression.
But it wasn't long before she realized their more sinister intentions.
There was a moment when I was walking with a friend of mine, but the rule was that when you saw a patrol approaching, you had to get off the pavement and walk in the gutter. And I walked off into the gutter, but this friend of mine did not. And a patrol pulled out his revolver and shot my friend through the head. And believe you me, that was the moment that I grew up.
Almost immediately, Jewish families were forced to live in ghettos. But as Hitler's terrifying agenda played out, Kitty and her mother were condemned to Auschwitz. It was a name that initially meant very little.
My mother knew Auschwitz as a place where she used to go fishing, because my mother was born perhaps like 20 kilometers north of Auschwitz on a farm. There was nothing there, just a swampy area.
When they arrived, the reality couldn't have been more different.
When we got there, the very first thing that hit you was the most incredible stench of burning. That's the first thing, that just hit you as you got nearer. And my mother, she said, I can't imagine they're roasting a lot of meat here. That was her expression.
It was an innocence that daily life in Auschwitz would soon destroy. Kitty was sent to work at the gas chambers, sorting out the clothes the victims left behind.
You heard people scream, you know, so you knew what was going on. You saw all the bodies come out, so you did know. Because they couldn't burn all the bodies all in one go, so very often the bodies were heaped up at the edge of the gas chambers. People just totally lost their will to live. It was the easiest thing to do, you know, to lose your will to live and die.
In Auschwitz, most lived for just a matter of months. Kitty survived nearly 2 years. In 1945, the Nazis were finally defeated. And the concentration camps liberated. Kitty and her mother travelled to England to live with her uncle and his family. But relief soon gave way to shock at her uncle's reaction to what she'd been through.
My uncle came to collect us, and on the way he announced, "Just remember, in my house, I don't want you to speak about anything that happened to you. I don't want to know, and I don't want my 2 girls upset."
Kitty's memories were too painful for a war-weary world.
They shut it out. And that set the scene in England for the next 10 years, easily. It was just a total indifference that actually got me angry. And I vowed, no matter what I was going to do in my life, I've got to make quite sure that people know what had happened.
After the suffering she'd endured, the denial of Kitty's experiences gave her a new purpose, a determination to tell the world her story. And in 1978, she finally got her chance, when she was approached by Yorkshire Television to make a film about her time in Auschwitz. The trip was a moment to hand her memories on to the next generation. But it was also an act of defiance against a world that wanted to forget.
Everybody out of our hometown, all your father's family, everybody's ashes are here.
It was this film that helped begin to shift public perceptions about the Holocaust.
People suddenly sat up because they saw something, you know? And people have got to see it, because I realized very early on, if you don't, it's going to happen again to somebody, somewhere, at some time. And that's what drove me. It's most important now. Do you know why? Because there are people in this world, they said, this has never happened. They're saying, oh, this has all been, you know, it's not true. I'm here just to see that it is true, it was true. And so that when you have children, you can bring them here and tell them about this. And I owe this to all the people that have died. I'm sure I do.
Jana Klausner is a senior rabbi in one of Britain's main Jewish denominations.
I can't remember when I first heard about the Holocaust, because it was always there as a constant, present and undercurrent narrative in our lives, both from the point of view of people who were survivors or having had family killed in the Holocaust, and my father being very involved in post-Holocaust issues.
Laura's father, Lord Greville Jana, was a Nazi war crimes investigator for the British Army.
My father told us many stories about the family, and when someone tells you and tells you and tells you, first of all, you take it for granted it's going to be there, that story, and you can ask them about it. And secondly, you get told so often, you don't want to hear it anymore. And this was Dad's thing, the Holocaust, talk about the Holocaust, talk about the Holocaust. And at one point, you're just like, enough Holocaust. I want to focus on the present, or I want to focus on something more positive.
But in 2010, her father was diagnosed with dementia. It was a moment that changed her entire perspective.
As my father's dementia got worse, I realised that somebody else needed to tell that story. So it was his decline in capacity that made me think I need to pick up that baton.
Her father's illness prompted Laura to begin to look more deeply into her own family's connection to the Holocaust. And she found that many of her ancestors came from Lithuania, where Nazi atrocities against the Jews were committed on an industrial scale.
So here are documents, historical documents. They show the history of our family in Lithuania, in Plungė. They show my great-great-grandparents, Max and Sarah. And this one I love, it shows what their situation was. So you have, this one is a beggar, this one is very poor, this one makes candles. It just really places us firmly in Plungė as a family. That is our Holocaust story. And for the next generation to be able to talk, to have a voice, the integrity of that voice is to really know the story. So I need to go to Lithuania to place myself in that context.
By 1941, the Nazis had continued their march through Europe and reached Lithuania. For a people who'd been under the tyrannical thumb of Soviet Russia, this was the key to their freedom. But it wasn't long before the Nazis' horrifying intentions were revealed. For the first time, Laura's traveled to the Lithuanian village of her ancestors to find out the fate of the Jews who once lived here. Every year, a small group of local people gather to keep a memory alive. A memory so horrific that those who recall it still can't reconcile themselves to its horror. This forest lies 4 kilometers outside Plungė. And it's here that on the 23rd of July 1941, the Jews of the village were forced to march.
Just behind us, there's a statue that was carved out of a woman covering her eyes. And I can't work out whether that's saying, this is where people turned a blind eye, this is people where didn't look. But just being in this forest, which is my history, our history, I feel it's contaminated. Yeah, makes me feel sick.
Nu atsitiko taip, kaip atsitiko, neįbuvo, bet kas žinojo karo pradžioje, kad bus taip.
In a community where the Jews once made up half the population, today only one still survives. Jakovas Bunka is the only remaining Jew in Plungė.
The Jews here were taken and locked up in the synagogue for 2 weeks, completely starved, No food, no water. Children, the elderly, men and women. People died, you couldn't take them out. And on the 15th of July, they opened the door, and those who managed, I think miraculously, to be alive were walked here 4 kilometres. Babies and children were taken from their parents, and rather than wasting a bullet, why waste a bullet? They smashed the children against the trees and against the rocks, their heads. The adults they shot, and they threw them into the pits. That's what happened here.
This was the last trip Jacobas Bunker ever made to the forest in which his family died. 2 weeks after this ceremony, he passed away.
It makes it much more real. Because when you live in Britain and you don't, thank God, have mass graves, it's distant. But if you're here and this is part of my memory and part of my pain map now, more, then it makes me more determined to look after other people and more determined to defend people who are vulnerable, marginal or silenced. And that, I feel, is my job.
This week marks the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And as the voices of the survivors fade away, their memories are now in everyone's hands.
Have we a guarantee that this cannot happen again? I think everybody has to know what people are capable of, isn't it? And what can happen. It's my duty to say what I've witnessed, to protect future generations.
The story of the Holocaust is owned by everyone because it's all about how we treat our neighbour, how we treat the other, how we treat people who are different or odd. We need to learn from the Holocaust about what can happen if you dehumanise people.
Can't say that it'll never happen again, but it's a step in the right direction, isn't it, to remember it. It's the very least you can do, isn't it?